Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the last HS Spotlight event. My name is Brent Hazlett. I'm the Executive Director of the HS Foundation, and I'm pleased to have with me tonight John Sobjoviak. And I will just say in advance that I was not supposed to moderate tonight. Eris Hilburn, who's a patient with Hope for HS, is having technical difficulties. I hope she's able to join us at some point. If not, my apologies. You will be stuck with me, but hopefully Eris will be able to join. Um, anyway, John is here to help you hopefully all better understand more about HS clinical trials. John is a clinical research coordinator in San Antonio, Texas. He's worked in dermatology for 6 years and has experience working with patients of all stages of hidradenitis suppurativa, as well as other skin conditions. In his spare time, he enjoys running, cooking, and trying new restaurants. And super excited to have John with us here tonight to share with us his knowledge and experience in clinical trials. So I will turn it over to John.
Thank you so much, Brent. I'm going to go ahead and flip over. Let's go back to the start here and just go ahead and get started. So this is going to be kind of a broad overview of clinical trials. So this will kind of walk you guys through the process of getting started in a clinical trial, what clinical trials really do, and all of that. So just kind of a broad definition of research. Research is a systematic investigation, including research development, testing, and evaluation designed to develop or contribute to the generalizable knowledge. So really, research is just taking things step by step from the idea of what a drug could be and then bringing it into testing, evaluation, looking at safety concerns, all of those things, and then finally, hopefully contributing something to the general public, the general knowledge. Whether that's for the positive or the negative is kind of to be found out. And so, yeah, it's really cool to be a part of research, especially now we're getting to see a lot of really cool drugs come out and move on. So what we'll really hit on is what are clinical trials, why they're important, what the process is step by step, what rights and protections there are for a patient, and then finding a clinical trial that fits each patient. Clinical trials aim to improve existing treatments or to replace them with new and better ones. And obviously that is the ideal. We want to come out with new and better treatments. We want to constantly be improving on what's already out there, things like that. And so before a new treatment can be made available for patients, it has to be tested in a controlled clinical trial for two things, efficacy and safety. These trials are designed to tell us both the positive and negative effects of a treatment, and a treatment's efficacy and safety can only fully be assessed after long-term use on a patient in everyday clinical practice. So really what that means is like every trial is looking for not just the positive effects of a treatment, but also the negative. I think that's something really to highlight here. You know, we talk a lot about the positive effects of a trial, but there definitely can be negative effects of them as well. And then we only know these things after we've done them on patients, after we've walked patients through the trials, looked at how these things affect a human population and what this looks like in an everyday population. So this, I really like this slide. This really goes over the clinical trial process and what it looks like to us. So discovery and preclinical is really your early science. A lot of this is going to be done at the university level. A lot of this is going to be, you know, we have an idea for how we could create this molecule. Let's create this in a lab setting. And then you're going to take that and figure out then how to make it more pure, how to make it better. And then you'll take that and do your early trials in usually, you know, these are trials that are done on mice, things like that, to see how it affects a mammal population. Then you take it over. We think we have something good. We think we have something that could work here. And you go into what's called a phase 1 trial. phase 1 trials are really about figuring out what is the dose that's going to work in our patient population, what is the effects of this medication going to be. A lot of times phase 1 trials or early phase 1 trials will be healthy volunteer trials. So these are going to be things like people who don't have a disorder, just to test the medication to see if there's immediate effects on the heart, on the liver, on the kidneys, what's going on with these drugs internally. Once we realize that in these healthy populations that these drugs are safe, then we might start looking at a phase 1 trial that's looking for HS populations or whatever they're looking at, and say, all right, now what's the ideal dose for these patients? And so they'll do studies looking at the blood concentrations of these medications. And then once we've figured out more of the dosing, then we'll go into a phase 2 trial. Phase 2 trials are going to be looking at slightly bigger populations, whereas phase 1 is maybe 5 to 10 people per study. Phase 2 might be 25, might be 50. So your population is getting a little bit bigger. Now we've kind of figured out how this dosing is going to work. And so now we're looking at safety and efficacy. So a lot of trials that you might see are going to be phase 2 or even phase 3. Those are the majority of the trials that are going on. Phase 2 trial, like I said, we're really looking at safety and efficacy. These will be a little bit longer as well. Maybe we're trying these drugs for 6 months instead of 2 weeks, and really looking at what is the long-term safety, what does the long-term efficacy look like. And then we move on to phase 3 trials. Phase 3 trials can be kind of difficult to film, but these are going to be your long-term trials. Sometimes we see trials that are going on for 2, even 3 years in phase 3 with people on the treatment. They've kind of worked out what the dose is actually going to look like in these populations. And now we just are trying to recruit hundreds of people to test the drugs, to look at long-term, again, still safety and efficacy, but to say, yes, this drug is safe. Now we can repeat these results in a larger population. And once you've shown that the drug is repeatable, that people do have long-term safety and efficacy effects from these drugs, then it goes on to get FDA approval, where it's then released to the general public. And then it's readily available, or sometimes not so readily, but that's a different conversation. So the importance of clinical trials is controlled clinical trials are going to help develop new and better treatments for patients. And assessing efficacy and safety of a new treatment is a rigorous, often long process. So it can take a long time for these treatments to become publicly available. So that graphic that we were looking at, this is not a short process. Usually you're talking like half a year for phase 1 or more. And then they have to look at that data and go through multiple phase 1. Phase 2 is going to be a year long with a long time to look at data again. And then phase 3, when you start getting into those long-term trials, then that's when you're kind of nearing that end of that process, but it's still years long from start to finish to get any drug on the market. So clinical trials are a really important process to getting there, to making sure that we have these treatments available. I already kind of said the main aim of a clinical trial is to enhance newer existing treatments and diagnostic strategies. So what can we do different? These clinical trials are here to really provide us with new options in that. And they're important because they investigate and compare new and existing treatments, promoting progress in treatment. I think you really see this with like psoriasis, where maybe the early drugs that they were looking at were a little bit more risky in terms of side effects. And now that we've had all these clinical trials in the last 20 years, you now have drugs that are very safe and that are very effective for large parts of the population. And we're kind of starting to get there with HS as well. So it's getting very, very exciting. Every clinical trial is designed to answer questions about the effects of a treatment being compared, and the quality of a clinical trial and its results depend on how well these questions are chosen, building on new evidence, and on good trial design. And so we'll get a little bit more into trial design and things like that in a little bit. But asking the right questions, setting the right goals for trials can be really successful in providing results and providing new treatments. So when conducting a clinical trial, researchers, that's where I come in, we follow a written study plan. This is going to be called a study protocol. If you're ever involved in a study, you might hear us referring to the protocol a lot. The protocol is there to ensure patient safety, and it's essential for achieving results that have quality, that are reliable, that are repeatable. And so without these protocols, we wouldn't have results, or we wouldn't have new drugs, really. So some clinical trials are conducted on one group of patients only, whereas most compare two groups. So one group would be like your healthy studies, those early studies. And then oftentimes when you get into phase 2 and 3 trials, you're going to have a comparison group. And these have to be similar as possible. So we're looking for people who have the same medical conditions, the same stage of the disease. And that's all outlined by that protocol. We're going to be looking for people who really have the same, just the same stage of the disease and things like that. So that has to be all outlined in the protocol, what we're looking for. And that's to help with the safety of these trials as well. So the most common types of trials that you will hear referred to are, the most common one is a randomized trial. And what that really means is that patients are going to be assigned to one group or another by a method called a randomization. This is purely by chance. There might be other factors that come into play, but within the overall of it, it's going to be designed by chance. When I say there's other factors, sometimes if studies have, moderate or severe patients enrolled, then a certain number of those moderates are going to be randomly assigned to one group versus another, and the same with like severe patients. Sometimes this can include a placebo group. Other times it's going to include a standard of care. So it just really depends on what we're looking at. If there is a standard of care available, that treatment has to be built into the protocol as something that's available to these patients. Whereas if there is not a standard of care, then it has to be compared to a placebo at some point in the study to prove that the medication is effective. The other type of trial you'll hear referred to is a blinded trial. And what this really means, and blinded and randomized really will go hand in hand nowadays. Like almost all the trials that we do are a blinded, not placebo-controlled necessarily, but blinded randomized study. And so in a blinded study, then neither the researchers nor the patients will know which group participants have been assigned to. This type of trial being blinded or masked, and it's going to ensure that the comparability is there. And so what that really means is when the doctor goes in, or when I go in and I'm looking at somebody's skin, and we're not biased by knowing that they're on treatment, or knowing that they're on standard of care, or knowing that they're on placebo, because we have no idea. We're going in and we're looking at the patient as kind of a blank slate. How are you doing today in this moment? And so blinding a trial just really helps remove any kind of bias, and it prevents a drug from getting moved on to another phase of research because of a bias of one person wanting it to work out better, wanting this to be a better treatment. So then we can sometimes put the blinders on and see things the way we want to see them, essentially. So that breaks down some of the terminology you might hear in trials. There are so many other types of trials that I just don't have time to go into all of them. We could spend hours doing that, but blinded and randomized are the most common ones you'll hear. For ethical reasons, if during a clinical trial, one treatment is clearly shown to be superior to the comparison treatment, then there are independent data monitoring committees and safety committees, and they will oftentimes recommend that a trial is stopped and that the better treatment is offered to patients with whatever the health question is, or health problem is that we're studying or is in question. And so really what this means is there have been times where we have gotten trials that are not effective. And once you start seeing that data or that there's this large safety reason, then they'll stop that trial and then offer a treatment to patients that were taking part. And so really, as a patient, you should only enroll in a clinical trial after having really understood the benefits and the adverse effects that you might have during the trial. And so the data monitoring committees, the safety committees, the FDA, they've all made it essential that patients are given clear information before deciding whether or not to participate. And so that really will break down into part of the process, which is what's called an informed consent. And so an informed consent is a document. These are often very long. Sometimes they can be anywhere from 15 to 50 pages. And they're going to give you all of the important information about a clinical trial. And they're really going to help you decide whether or not to enroll in the trial. As a first step, every potential participant will meet with one of the clinical trial researchers, one of the doctors, and they'll explain the possible benefits and risks of participating. And then after that meeting is when you'll usually be given the informed consent, which is a really detailed document that goes over the clinical trial, and this will help consider whether or not to participate. We're oftentimes very good at summarizing these documents for people, but it's really nice to have some time to sit down and read it word for word for yourself and really understand what it is that you're signing up for. An informed consent document is going to have everything in it that you need. It will go over how many patients have already tried this medication, how many trials have they done in the past, what are the safety benefits of the medication, what are the risks that are involved, what are the risks that were observed in previous trials. It'll also go over what the visit schedule is like. When you're signing up for a clinical trial, it's not necessarily how it is in the real world. We do want to make sure that people are being monitored, that people are being safe. And so oftentimes you'll have a much more strict visit schedule. It's not, sometimes when you go into a clinic and they prescribe you a medication, they'll say, see you in 6 months. This is not always going to be that. Some trials do eventually get to a point where we see patients every 6 months. But for the most part, we're going to be seeing you quite frequently. Sometimes it can be once a week for a period of the trial. Sometimes it can be every 4 weeks. And so really understanding the time commitment of a trial, that's all going to be in the informed consent. It'll also have how your information is kept protected and things like that. So it's a very detailed document, and you just want to make sure you feel comfortable with all of the information in it and before signing it, because it does have a portion at the back end of it that is signed by both you and the person that went over it with you. This is the first step that should always happen in ethical clinical research. If you decide to enroll in the study, you'll be asked to sign and date the informed consent declaration. The biggest thing about this is that you always have the right to decline an invitation to take part in a clinical trial. And really at any point during a trial, you can withdraw your consent. This is it is a binding document. It is a legal document stating that you are signing up to take part in the trial of your own free will, but you can always withdraw that consent, and there's no judgment. There's really no reason needed. A lot of times we will ask for a reason because we just have to document that, but it is not required. I just put down my presentation. And then when participating in a clinical trial, there might be periodic updates with relevant information, which could influence your decision to remain in the trial. And so, a lot of times as information is coming out, as we're doing these trials, the companies, that are conducting the trials will send us updated consent documents that have new information. Maybe they've identified a new side effect. Maybe they've identified greater benefit even. So it's not always a positive or a negative that's going into the updates. Sometimes it can be either or, sometimes it's very neutral information. Sometimes they're just updating the numbers. So you'll always be given a copy of any updates. You'll be given time to read over the updates, and those can sway your decision sometimes. And so, like I said earlier, informed consent does not obligate you to remain in a clinical trial. You can leave the clinical trial at any time without giving any explanation. If you just decide you're not comfortable with it anymore, that is totally okay. The informed consent process, this is your time to ask any questions about the study, share any doubts that you're having. The bottom line here is that it's just essential to understand the key statements and understand the treatment, what's going on, what's happening, what are the risks, what are the benefits, to really weigh those, to have those conversations. Because once you're signed up, it's harder to address those concerns sometimes. Like, you will be seeing us, like I said, quite frequently, but we want to make sure that those are addressed before you sign up, and that you are signing up and feeling comfortable. And ideally that you are seeing the trial through from start to finish, because that can affect the data, and that can have a huge effect on whether or not a medication is going to get approved in the end. They do build in a certain amount of people leaving the trial early, but we want to make sure that people are sticking with it and, giving us the full picture of how this really affects a person and affects the disease state as well. So really, the clinical trial process, and what I really want everybody to take away from the process is the process is built with patient safety in mind. Patient safety is always the number one thing. It is always so exhaustively addressed in a protocol. I know that, the protocols are often 200 pages long, and I read every page of them. And we get so many throughout the year that, I just want to reassure people that these protocols are really built with patient safety in mind. And that's done very, very obviously. They do this because they want people to feel safe. They want people to be involved. This is really important in building that relationship, building that trust. And so my primary experiences in phase 2 and phase 3. So by the time it's getting to me, oftentimes they'll already know side effects and things like that. So we'll be able to have those conversations with patients. But, I always say, when patients are asking me or saying that they're worried about side effects, there are side effects possible with every medication out there. People can become allergic to ibuprofen even. And so really, just being in a trial is a very controlled environment. We have a protocol outlined for if somebody is having a reaction, what do we do and what steps do we take to make sure that their safety is in mind and that they're really being held as the utmost priority of the study over the drug. So yeah, just definitely feel like these things are thought of. Your safety is important, and it is being looked out for. And with that, the basic ethical principles and legal codes which govern medical practice also apply to treatments given in clinical trials. And so, like I said earlier, if the risk-benefit ratio is seen to not be there, if a drug is not working, if treatment is not working, then they will close those trials. And there are people that are watching this to make sure that these trials are being done ethically and that patient safety is being kept in mind. So like I said, to protect trial participants, clinical trials are governed through further international guidelines and legislation. We have to follow good clinical practices. We have to make sure that people are being looked out for first and foremost when conducting any kind of trial. And so there are many, many, many bodies that are in play when conducting these trials. There is boards that are above us that are constantly reviewing what we're doing. We have to make sure that we're submitting things to these boards saying that we are conducting this research within the ethical guidelines and that patient safety is the top priority. Before a trial can start, it is checked for patient safety and scientific content by an ethics committee and any other competent authorities. So we have to submit many documents to what's called a IRB, and the IRB reviews these things to make sure that there are safety controls in place and that there are control measures for all ethically practiced studies. Results from clinical trials are going to be made public. These are usually done at scientific conferences, in journals, press releases, and all of the results are reported to relevant authorities. And another way that your safety is looked out for is that the identity of trial patients always remains confidential. So while you may be working at a site, who knows who you are, the overall drug company, the Pfizer, the Johnson & Johnson's, they do not know who you are. And this is just to protect your identity, to protect your personal information, things like that. And so this will always be made confidential. You're never going to be identified with any of this, but your results in a de-identified fashion will be used as part of the study and as part of helping get this medication approved. So when considering a clinical trial, the major reason most people consider a trial is going to be for the hope of benefiting from access to a new treatment option, especially in conditions like HS, where there's not a lot out there that works for a lot of people. It can be really exciting to get that possible benefit from having access to a new treatment. And this is going to be a way for patients to receive new experimental treatments that aren't generally available, especially true for diseases with no known cure. And so it can be really exciting to do that, to take part in that, to be able to have access to a newer treatment, to something that is not yet available. But you also want to make sure that it's going to have that benefit for you. Clinical trial participants often wish to contribute to research to help other patients by participating in clinical trials. That's something that we hear a lot, that people will sign up because they want to be able to help provide treatments for other people. I put this in here just to avoid disappointment. Remember that new treatments are never guaranteed to be better than on-the-market treatments. There's potential for these treatments to be worse. We really don't know yet. That is part of why it is research. We are hoping to expand the generalizable knowledge and to understand whether something is going to have a positive or a negative benefit, or it might just be a neutral benefit. Some of these treatments might just end up being kind of the same as what we already have. Before considering a trial, take into account your whole health picture. Now, what I really mean by this is take into account what you have going on. A lot of trials, we have part of what is the protocol is that we have a lot of criteria that we have to go through with patients and make sure that they meet. And so patients who unfortunately have autoimmune conditions or things like that will oftentimes be excluded because these patients can have a higher risk of negative side effects with a medication. So it just depends, looking at your overall health picture. You know, are you a pretty healthy person who maybe just has HS, or are you somebody who has a lot of other conditions going along with it, and there might be additional added risk to taking part in a trial? You know, sometimes there are medications that are known to have a slightly negative effect on somebody's heart, for example, but it's only if they have a pre-existing condition that they know that this will happen. So that might not be the best trial for you to try and take part in if you already have a pre-existing condition with your heart. And so just really take your time, read the informed consent, ask questions, and weigh the pros and cons and do your own research. A lot of these things are going to be available, and I'll give you some tools to look at online. You can even look up, most of the pharmaceutical companies will have their pipeline, and so you can kind of learn a little bit about the medication before you're even signed up for a trial. And so it can be really helpful to understand what's going in and to come prepared with questions about the medication, about the side effects, about things that might worry you about a specific trial. So yeah, definitely weighing the pros and cons is going to be huge. Talking about HS and clinical trials, I'll kind of bring it home because I know that's what we're here for today, is to really talk about hidradenitis suppurativa and clinical trials for that. There have not been a whole lot of treatment options available for patients with the condition, and I know how debilitating it can be. I've worked on a number of trials myself with HS patients, and those are some of my favorite trials because we're really hopefully on our way to finding something that works. So the way that they're measuring whether or not this works is by using a high score, is what we call it, or a hidradenitis suppurativa clinical response score. It's looking at a lot of factors, mainly the reduction of inflammatory lesions. So these are going to be abscesses, inflammatory nodules, things like that. And so this is the main measure that HS trials are looking at to get a reduction of a high score, essentially. And the way that they're doing this is by looking at like how much your counts of these reduce over the course of a trial. And so previous trials, they have maybe had 50% or less than 50% of patients achieve a high score 50 reduction, which means a 50% reduction in the number of abscesses and the number of inflammatory nodules, inflammatory lesions. The really cool thing about trials that are coming through our pipeline now is that they're all looking to achieve high score 70 and high score 90, which is ideally a really big improvement. And so we're starting to see the bar kind of raise. A lot of these companies are starting to look at HS and to try and get better clearance of the disease state and to have a lot better improvement of people's pain, of lack of sleeping, things like that. And those are all secondary things that they'll look at as well. But the main thing that they're looking at is reduction of the active abscesses, lesions, things like that. And so it's been really cool to see the growth and the amount of trials that we're seeing come through for HS. I work for definitely a much smaller company. There's not too many of us, so unfortunately we aren't able to take on all of the ones that we would like to. But in the past, we would have maybe one HS trial every 2 to 3 years. And we've gotten approached for about 5 trials this year already. And we're just starting the year. So we're definitely excited to see some treatments get out there for HS, but those can't happen without willing volunteers to participate in these trials. And so with that being said, we'll talk about trial registers really quick, which are going to be your best friend when looking for a trial. Trial registers exist because suppression of clinical trial data is really, really problematic. When the data is not transparent and easily available, people feel like they're kind of being neglected a little bit, or maybe their safety is not being looked at adequately. And so in these cases, trials depend on human volunteers, on people who want to take part in them, and trial results can then inform our medical decision. And so to avoid suppression of clinical trial data, clinicaltrials.gov was created. And this is really your kind of one-stop shop for finding out what a trial is all about, any information on that trial, and where you can find these trials. And so clinicaltrials.gov, if you go there, it will immediately take you to a screen where you can search by a lot of different things. You can search by a compound name if you know the medication that you're looking for. You can search by your area. You can search by disease state or condition, diagnosis, things like that. And so if you go into clinicaltrials.gov and look for hidradenitis suppurativa, you will see a lot of trials ongoing right now, and then you can kind of see if there are sites near you as well, because it will tell you every site that's taking part in a clinical trial, in a particular clinical trial. And it'll give you the address, it'll give you the phone number, and then you can kind of contact that site to see about taking part, or if you will be a good fit for the trial. And then the other resource that I have is the World Health Organization's International Clinical Trial Registry platform. This is a very similar database. It's not as user-friendly as clinicaltrials.gov, but it's also a good place to look for further information on what a clinical trial is about and things like that. And so this kind of brings me to the end. Really what I want to drive home here is that research is always going to be set up with patient safety in mind. We really do a lot to make sure that patients are kept very, very safe during these trials. You're constantly having monitoring of your blood, of your heart, of things like that, just to make sure that no unnecessary changes, unnecessary side effects are taking place. And then contributing to a research trial or taking part is an extremely personal decision. Take your time, do your research, ask your questions. I know that myself, my colleagues, I have never met a coordinator who is annoyed by too many questions. We definitely like it when people bring a lot of questions to the appointments, because it shows that they're paying attention, that they know what they're signing up for, and that they're really understanding how important this is. So I definitely love it when people bring questions to the appointment and are staying involved in their care, really. Weigh the risks with the benefits. If you feel like something is off, if you feel like the risks if the benefit is not greater than the risk, then definitely I can understand not wanting to participate. Especially with the number of trials that we're seeing, there's definitely a trial that will feel like the right fit for you if you're really wanting to participate. So just make sure you find that one. And then be excited. This is a crucial part of scientific development. Without volunteers and trials, we wouldn't have the many fantastic treatments that exist today. Everything that you can buy over the counter has gone through extensive clinical trials to make sure that it's safe, to make sure that it's effective, even down to generics. Doing generic clinical trials is a thing. So generic medications or store brands have to be proven before they can even be sold. And so this is a really exciting forefront to be on and to be a part of. And so we definitely always love when people are willing to take part in trials and really get excited about them. So I was aiming to give about 15 minutes for any questions, and I think I hit it right on. So does anybody have any questions they want to pop into the Q&A, pick my brain about anything clinical trial related? I'm happy to answer anything people might have.
Thank you, John. Really appreciate you going through this important topic. I know you sort of touched on, the number of clinical trials taking place right now in HS is far and away greater than there ever has been in the history of treatments for HS. So it's important for people to be comfortable about the process itself and not take it lightly, because it is an important decision to make. I want to welcome Eris, who is our moderator for Q&A as well. So she and I will kind of tag team this, and I'll just as we're waiting for questions to come in, I'll ask a question. What fears and hesitancy do you see patients bring to you when you sort of first talk about clinical trials, and how do you handle those conversations?
I mean, oh gosh, that's a tough one. So the immediate most common fear is side effects and just being nervous about side effects. And I always explain that pretty much the way that I did in here, because so many people walk into our clinic every day that are allergic to ibuprofen, which is a really common, really well-known medication. And some people even have an anaphylactic reaction to ibuprofen. So any drug that's on the market, any medication that's out there, any treatment that's out there comes with a risk of anything like anaphylactic reaction, allergic reaction, things like that. And so the thing that's really reassuring with a clinical trial from my perspective as somebody who runs these protocols day in and day out is that the safety is there. Every time a patient comes in, we're looking at their blood work. We're checking liver function. We're checking kidney function. We're checking not as frequently, but we are checking EKGs for the heart, things like that. And so the fact that you are coming in so frequently, meeting with the physicians, meeting with the staff, with the coordinators, is really reassuring as far as side effect profiles go, because if something were to happen, we're going to catch it really quick. Whereas, even treatments that are already FDA approved, they have those same side effects. They have those known side effects. And so in that case, somebody could come in and get prescribed something on the clinic side, and they could walk out the door and not come back for 6 months. And by then it can be a real problem if they are having a side effect. So that's kind of how I address that concern. The other concern that comes in is that, a lot of people feel like they're being guinea pigs. And so we always hate that terminology. You're not being a guinea pig. This is not guinea pig research. Like, you have a say, you have autonomy. We definitely want people to feel like they are a part of this and that they are getting access not only to something that's new, that's advanced, that's probably going to be, that could be a better treatment alternative. But again, you're not, your safety is highly regarded, and we are definitely making sure that safety is number one. So people should never feel like it's guinea pig research. We're not doing anything like that. It is definitely very, very safe. There are many people monitoring this to make sure that things are done in a very safe fashion. So hopefully that answers that question.
Hi, sorry I'm late, everybody. I was having technical issues. My name is Eris Hilburn, and I've had HS for about 20 years. I've just completed my second clinical trial for HS. And John, earlier you were talking about like reactions and things like that. If somebody comes in and the study notices that they have the potential for something that could be lifelong, or say pregnancy, how long would the site versus the drug company follow that person throughout the course of their illness?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in that case, if they notice something that is going to be lifelong, then usually the trials are immediately shut down. But the drug companies, as well as the site that has that patient, so if a patient, does end up with something that's lifelong, and, I say that it would be something that is immediately shut down in the trial. That's if it's repeatable. If multiple patients come in with something that is lifelong and it's all kind of the same thing, then we would attribute it to the medication. The trial would be shut down. If somebody is like the medication, but it's just followed for the lifetime, essentially. And pregnancy is a whole other, I hate to say condition entirely, but the word is not coming to mind, but it's a different path entirely. Most trials have a built-in what to do if somebody becomes pregnant while on the trial. There are very few studies that actually want to test medications on pregnant women, because that's just a whole different ethical concern. And so it's very hard oftentimes to say whether a medication is pregnancy safe or not. And those trials are oftentimes reserved for medications that we know have a very, very incredible safety profile and are not going to do any harm. But usually coming onto a trial is going to require you to be on some form of birth control. We're oftentimes seeing requirements for both women and men nowadays, because they are not studied in like spermatogenicity and things like that, how it's passed from male to female. So birth control is usually a requirement, and that can be over the course of the study. And then if somebody does become pregnant while on the study, because these things are not 100% effective, most birth controls, then we do follow that mother for the entire term of her pregnancy to make sure she's okay. She would oftentimes be removed from the study. And then we follow that baby as well for most of its early life until certain developmental markers have been hit to make sure that there's no effect from these medications. And so in a way, like sometimes pharmaceutical companies actually get very valuable data from having accidental pregnancies on a study because they do get to follow that. But it is something that's kept highly regarded. And so patients with long-term side effects and pregnancy, things like that, are followed for a very long time and provided any care that they need.
Thanks, John. Question that came in is, are clinical trials only for medications, or are there other treatments? Or,
That's
something
a
that
great
comes to mind
question.
for me is like wound care. Is that something that would go through like clinical trials?
Yeah, a lot of times wound care will be considered a clinical trial. There are definitely different wound care trials out there. I don't have a whole lot of experience in wound care. It just depends on, are we looking at a new technology for like a bandage? And sometimes a technology like that will fall under the microscope of a device trial. And device trials are set up in a very similar way to medication trials, but sometimes they'll fall under medication trials if there is a active ingredient that's being looked at and it's using a bandage that's already known. So there are the two types of trials that really come to mind for me are going to be medication trials and device trials. Device trials are really going to be looking at things like maybe we have this auto injector that will deliver a medication differently. And so it's looking at maybe a same medication, but a different device. Even things like chemotherapies, radiation therapies, those do go through clinical trials as well. So there definitely can be other types of treatments, but I would say the majority of clinical trials are going to be medication clinical trials.
What about like lasers, particularly in procedures when it relates to HS?
Lasers and procedures, cosmetics too. Even cosmetics go through clinical trials. Cosmetic clinical trials, depending on what it is, really undergo the same type of trial as a medication trial, but like devices, like from a strictly cosmetic perspective, right? Like devices like radio frequency devices, like insults and things like that, those go through clinical trials that are more device oriented as well.
Sarah, do you want to ask the next one?
Yeah, this is from Ray, and they are asking, do they have a long-term effect in your body if you are on the clinical trial, because they are currently participating in a clinical trial?
Yeah, oftentimes there is no long-term effect on your body. It's really difficult to say because that's part of what we're doing in research, is studying side effects, studying efficacy, studying how these treatments work. And so I would say oftentimes there is not a long-term effect on your body. Oftentimes, if an effect is observed, especially in a controlled environment, and we are able to stop it and intervene in time, then the body is very good at flushing things out and removing medications from it. And so those do lessen over time. It is incredibly rare to see a side effect that is long-term on a trial that lasts, you know, somebody's lifetime. It's incredibly rare to see something like that.
You mentioned that a lot of the time involved in getting from a sort of an idea all the way to FDA approval. What do you see in timelines? I mean, you know, I think it's important to keep this in mind because, you know, we only had one approved therapeutic for many, many years. The second one finally got approved last year. And I think it's easy to think that it's going to be another 10 years before we really have any answers to these things. But, you know, the reality is that a lot of these drugs are already in phase 3, which is sort of the last piece. But just give a sense of what is that timeline from start to finish typically?
I mean, you know, I would say honestly, from start to finish, from development, from the lab, it probably is close to 10 years. But the fact that we are seeing so many of these in phase 3 now, phase 2, phase 3, that's primarily where I work, like I said. And the fact that we've seen 5 phase 2, phase 3 protocols in the beginning part of the year is incredible. Because at that point, you're really looking at anywhere from, and I know it sounds like a long time, but 2 to 3 years for FDA approval. It just depends on the trial design. And a lot of times, once you get to phase 3 as well, a lot of these protocols are now opting to have what's called an open label extension study. And there are times where if they're showing that there's really good results, that they'll have this extension so trial patients can stay on the medication, especially if they're benefiting. And sometimes those will go on well into the approval phase. So once it's FDA approved, you still get access to the medication for 2-3 additional years before they finally say, okay, now we're ending this trial and we'll get it covered through your insurance, or you can go into this assistance program. And so I think it's really, really close to see a lot more therapies now popping up. Once they're in phase 3, I know it sounds like a slow process, but time moves so quickly for me that it's a very fast process, right? Like, when you have these 2-year long studies, they go by so quickly. And at that point, it's really a year or 2 away from approval, hopefully.
I also think it's important and exciting to point out that, you know, the first couple approved therapeutics were approved for other indications before they then became approved for HS. And there are several therapeutics in the pipeline now that were specifically targeted for HS from the get-go, which is very exciting.
Yeah, definitely.
Eris, I know there's a couple more questions that came in. I'll let Eris ask one of these.
Do you know if there's any trials for covering scars? And I will add to this, do you know of any other place such as clinicaltrials.gov where somebody can go and seek out specific clinical trials that they're looking for?
So I have not heard of any for covering scars. So that is a great question. I would have to dig into that a little bit more. I know that a lot of times we have lasers that have been studied for scar treatment and things like that. And so really it's about right now getting the condition under control. And then once you get that, then they'll probably start looking at, okay, now what can we do about this scarring? But of course, you know, hypertrophic scarring is very common with HS patients. And so I haven't really heard of anything right now for just in my personal experience for scarring or covering the scars or anything like that. So that's a good question.
Someone asks, are there situations where the timeline for a trial gets extended? For example, if there's encouraging results or maybe even questionable results, and they decide that, I know there's like you can do phase 2B and things like that. Is that an indication that the trial is
And
extended?
so, yeah, phase 2B is usually going to be like a different study entirely. So maybe, you know, they submitted their data to move on to phase 3 to the FDA, and the FDA came back and said, well, what about this specific question? Or why don't we look at this? And so a lot of times, or if there was like maybe something more that they identified that they want to look into before moving on to a larger population, they'll do a phase 2B trial. So phase 2B, I wouldn't think is as much of an extension. But yeah, there are very often times where if a study is getting good results, that they will extend it. That is that open label extension that I kind of talked about. I haven't seen too many of those yet for HS, but I definitely think it's coming, where if the results are really there, they will want to look at long-term having patients on, and just really making sure that they are safe and effective over a long period of time. And so, I mean, like those open label extensions can go anywhere from, I've got one right now that's in a different disease state in psoriasis that's 2 years long. And again, it's on a medication that we know really works for psoriasis and is very safe too. And then I've seen them go on for, gosh, we have one that's been going on for 6 years now, that are just patients that are in a long-term open label. They're just receiving medication essentially for free, and just really occasional blood work at that point, not too much, because we know the safety effects at that point really, really well. So definitely we've seen them that are originally going to be 2 years long and get extended to 4 years. It just depends on the trial really, but we definitely see lots of times where they get extended.
I'll try to ask this last question. I think what they're asking is secukinumab the most effective drug that's come out of trials so far? I don't know if you can read that, John. That's my interpretation, but maybe I'm reading that incorrectly.
Yeah, I have not reviewed too much of the secukinumab data. I was not involved in that trial, so I really can't speak too much on it. I know that they supposedly had better results than the Humira trials, but I also know lots of patients that have been on it that have had kind of similar results to that. So it's very hard to comment too much on that because I don't know their data.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I've seen both data from both, and I think it just depends. Everybody has sort of a different response. That's one of the challenges with HS, right?
Definitely.
Yeah, and those are both biologics, and I think that's another thing that's exciting about some of the clinical trials is there are going to be other modes of therapeutics that are coming down, whether it's topical or oral, things like that we haven't had before, which is exciting.
Yeah, it is definitely very exciting, and we definitely hope to start seeing some really strong results soon.
Yeah, well, John, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your evening, and Eris, you as well. And Eris, I'm so sorry we had technical difficulties, but I appreciate you joining and bringing John to us to educate us about clinical trials. Thank you all for joining tonight or any of the other webinars we had in the series. Just a reminder that the recording will be available in the next 24 hours. And I want to thank you all again for joining us. Have a great night.